What is up, people of Westeros? Welcome to my House of the Dragon Episode 1 recap, review, and breakdown. I know I'm a bit late with this. Unfortunately, I'm behind this week. Had to put up a video reviewing and breaking down The Sandman Episode 11 yesterday. Go check that out. If you haven't already, we get into depth on all kinds of things and backstory and Easter eggs. But today, I definitely wanted to cover this series. And, you know, I was looking forward to House of the Dragon, but at the same time, I wasn't like majorly hyped. It was one of those things where I was like, okay, you know, I'm looking forward to it. Matt Smith's in it. It's exploring the era of the Game of Thrones history, if you will, where the Targaryens were in a much different position from that of where we pick up in the timeline of Game of Thrones. And I just wanted to see how it would go. But long story short, I was pretty damn impressed with this episode. So we're going to go through the events of this episode bit by bit, talk about what's going on, and of course I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Go ahead and like this video if you do go on to enjoy it, and subscribe for more videos just like this. So the very beginning of this episode picks up with the Great Council, which was a great place to start it, no pun intended there, because it really does set up exactly where things are at, and also somewhat foreshadows where things will land for the Targaryen dynasty. As I kind of tease, by the time of Game of Thrones, they're literally down to a couple, and that is Daenerys Targaryen and Viserys Targaryen, and we all know what happens to him. And as we learn, at the end of the first century of the Targaryen dynasty came to a close, the health of the old king Heirs was failing. At this time, they had like 10 dragons under their belt. Like, the power of House Targaryen was not to be, you know, messed with at all, and still isn't really even after that. And when we had Viserys crowned king in this moment, his heir as well, and that is because, unfortunately, the two sons of King Jaehaerys have died. But the interesting thing about this as well is that the heir was being decided between not only Viserys, but also Rhaenys. I do excuse me if I butcher any pronunciations during these episode reviews. I'm sure I'll get used to it. The thing is about Viserys, he wasn't exactly like seeking king, like crazily so, as they go into the behind the scenes of this episode. Definitely check that out if you haven't already. As with like Westworld and previously Game of Thrones, they go into a little behind the scenes segment at the end of each episode, and they explain how, you know, if anything, he's just trying to live up to the old king's rule because he was quite the peacekeeper for 60 years and he wasn't like dying for it, unlike maybe you could say Matt Smith's Daemon Targaryen would definitely, you know, kind of like to sit on that throne. I mean, after all, the first time we freaking see him is him sat on the Iron Throne itself. But that's when we pick up with a dragon in the sky, and of course it is Rhaenyra riding her dragon Syrax. She's been able to ride dragons for years and years. The difference between this is kind of like Game of Thrones with Daenerys Targaryen. They were really young in those books. A lot of the characters were, but they're somewhat aging Rhaenyra up here, as with Daenerys and, you know, Viserys in Game of Thrones. And she's been riding dragons since she was quite a young girl. So you can bet your ass that will come in handy in the future of this series. But the thing is, we also have Daemon Targaryen with his dragon as well, Caraxes, and that will also come in pretty handy to him. At the same time as well, I appreciated the music that was playing in this scene as the dragon was just flying around. You could see the old dragon pit. Well, I say old dragon pit, but I'm just thinking in terms of when we saw Game of Thrones last. Obviously that was completely obliterated, but now back in this time, because we can't forget, as the intro teased, this is 172 years before the death of the Mad King and the birth of his daughter, Princess Daenerys Targaryen. So the dragon pit, where they keep dragons, very much so a natural building. The thing is, through keeping dragons in there, it somewhat halts their growth, because otherwise, if Caraxes and Syrax were allowed to kind of just always free roam, they could, in theory, become as big as Balerion the Black Dread, the very dragon skull that we've seen in Game of Thrones, but also in this very episode as well towards the end. And if you can't quite remember, Balerion the Black Dread was Aegon's dragon, and of whom Aegon we get teased quite a little bit about with Viserys at the end when he's talking to his daughter Rhaenyra about becoming queen, but also having this kind of added responsibility to unite the realms. And that's kind of what I like about this first episode. There's a lot going on. As with, it's always kind of a Game of Thrones, right? Even though it's called House of the Dragon. But already as this was unfolding, I was a big fan of the cast. I think Milia Alcock was absolutely fantastic fantastic. This is when she goes to see her mother, the queen, who is very heavily pregnant, and they are very much so expecting the birth of this baby, ideally by the tournament, because the tournament was kind of set up as a bit of a celebration around the time, and that's why we had the Maester doing his forecast for the baby's birth and whatnot, but we all know how that goes this episode, my God. But also in that conversation between Rhaenyra and her mother, they talk about a baby being there. They have royal wombs, and this is their battlefield. And obviously that was quite a parallel to the very joust, the battle that was going on, as quite literally the queen was having her own battle in childbirth. There's a lot of kind of comparisons like that they were deliberately doing, and they actually go into depth a bit more with in the behind the scenes of this episode. Now at this point we pick up with the king and his council. We have the Hand of the King, who is Otto Hightower, of which, there's a couple of suspicious seeds planted in this episode. I swear you can never fully trust Hands of the King, unless it's Tyrion, of course. But we also have Corlys Velaryon, who was actually teasing a certain character of whom we see at the promo at the end of this episode, talking about a man called Kragas Drehar, of whom has styled himself the Prince Admiral of this triarchy. So that's going to be a little bit of a side kind of issue this season. Corlys says that they call him the Crab Feeder due to his inventive methods of punishing his enemies. And he looks pretty dang nasty. He looks pretty creepy. So, considering the barbaric graphic scenes we have in this episode, just imagine what we're going to get with this guy. We also have Rhaenyra arrive kind of late because of the dragon riding as a cup holder, and despite, how this episode portrays a few things, the king is actually really close with his daughter. It's just that he's really wanted a son. As articulated quite a lot this episode, the precedent and tradition has always been that a man is to be on the throne, and to break that tradition just, wouldn't really be accepted amongst the realm or even that of other lords, which is going to be, considering how this episode ends, a big ripple effect that will carry on throughout the series, to be honest. And this is where we get Matt Smith's Daemon Targaryen introduction, and I really like his character. And even though you get a certain sense in the way he's portrayed this episode to be quite the problematic Targaryen, as they say, if you flip a coin kind of thing, you're either going to get one Targaryen or another type of Targaryen with the madness or whatever. They do say in the behind the scenes that Daemon's a complicated guy, but he's not a monster. He does love his family, particularly loves Rhaenyra, and that could be going somewhere potentially disturbing. But there is also kind of a deep, darker history of which we do get into a little bit with Viserys confronting Daemon Targaryen a little bit later in the episode. Certain feelings from Daemon's point of view and how he was always sent away. So there is always that kind of undertone of political aspects, even between that of family rather than even status, that all contributes to the politics of the Game of Thrones, really. And I'm really looking forward to see that unfold, because Matt Smith is a very talented actor, and I feel like in this particular role, there's going to be a whole range of things to go across, from the emotion, the sincerity that he does have for his family, the conflict he's going to now have potentially despite his affections for Rhaenyra and what that will bring, and just overall, even more drama between that of him and his brother, even though there is a deep love there still. That's, exactly what the whole Game of Thrones universe is about. And this is when we pick up with Rhaenyra and Lady Alicent. There's some interesting stuff there actually featured in the promo, but that I don't want to get too in detail with, but let's just say she's quite an interesting character, especially with her father being Lord Hightower, and the whole setup of sending his daughter to the king's chambers and whatnot. So that's going to go interesting places. Now, the next thing is very interesting, because the king seems to have a beginning of an infection on his back that the maesters were looking at, and I'm just thinking that this is meant to foreshadow maybe his ultimate end. I'm not sure if it's anything like grayscale, because I don't think it hasn't been remotely said that he's been in contact with anyone who has that. But I do feel like, at the end of the day, infections, especially back in those days, despite this being a fantasy world, are very problematic. You could die quite literally from sitting on the Iron Throne and getting a cut, which he literally later did get on his finger. So, despite them suggesting to cauterize the wound and things like that, I think this could potentially propel things in the future, because obviously by the end of the episode, Rhaenyra is named the heir. But if her father dies, that would just fling things forward even more for her to be queen, obviously, because she's the freaking heir. But she wouldn't have her father by her side there, and he's quite protective and will be very protective of her in episodes ahead. But I would love to know what you think of this infection. In between scenes like this, we have the queen in the bath, and they talk about how she can't really do this again. She's given birth to stillborns, and she's had miscarriages, and even another baby dying in the cradle, very similar to the child that will be born in this episode. So it's just really kind of sad to watch this unfold, especially obviously where it ends up. But up next, we get an even bigger taste of Daemon Targaryen making his presence known in the city of King's Landing, because obviously he is the commander of the City Watch, and essentially, as he says later on in the council chambers, much of King's Landing is seen as lawless and terrifying, and he wants to make the place safe for its people. The king agrees, but like the way that this was shown, in an unprecedented way, as they say, he was basically chopping several things off, you know, to the point of where they had 2 horse carts wheeling dismembered body parts. So yeah, he went pretty ham. And again, it shows like this kind of multifaceted aspect to this character, which I'm quite, as I said, looking forward to seeing be explored, because he does come across as like a very tyrant-y type Targaryen if he was to become king, but there is still these other sides to him as well. But again, I thought his performance was brilliant. I really feel like he's loving this role when he's playing it, and of course, these are the gold cloaks as well, so this goes quite into the future of Game of Thrones, as we know, in terms of the gold cloaks, and Daemon is the one who made it so that they had, you know, the color gold in their cloaks, and, you know, everyone will fear the color of gold. And it was just like a savage scene, and I can only imagine what's to come. Another thing is, I think his armor looks so cool. I love the dragon-esque helmet, like the kind of dragon snout there, and the kind of wings coming down. He looks really badass in it. But in that council meeting we were just talking about that happened after this, obviously there's a bit of a bitching session going on about Daemon with what happened there, but also it kind of sets up the little dance that Daemon has with Lord Hightower, the king's hand, and he goes pretty far with this, especially when we get to the tournament and stuff, even fighting and choosing to fight Lord Hightower's son, getting the favor from his daughter, Lady Alicent. He's really trying to rub it into him, but also this is despite how it comes across, and I'm sure he is enjoying it, but as when he's confronted by his brother later on after the comment he made in that speech, Daemon kind of views him this way because he feels like he doesn't protect his brother, the king, and how he sees Otto Hightower for who he really is. Then we have Daemon in the pleasure house, I guess you could say, and this, there's a certain comment made that kind of made me think, oh man, you know, with regards to how the mistress, if you will, could even arrange a certain person for him with silver hair, so just kind of staying true to a lot of the Targaryen ways of choosing their partner. And this is where we get to the tournament, and I really enjoyed this. And in the behind the scenes, the showrunners said that they wanted to make this sequence in the first episode to show what this series is capable of, so they needed some kind of typical Game of Thrones action in there, and this did get very bloody at certain points, and this is again just kind of like an appetizer to your several course meal as to what this show will get into in terms of that kind of violent, graphic, crazy ass entertainment. And so we get some jousting. It starts off fairly tame. We have some members such as Bormund Baratheon asking for favor of Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was, and I like the comment made to Viserys saying that you could have Baratheon's tongue for that, and he says tongues will not change the succession, but it's like, oh man, it does. Baratheon in 170 odd years time, or well, give or take, does indeed, as we know, become the king, and that is Robert Baratheon before he is, you know, taken down by a boar. Now this is when Rhaenyra asks Sir Harold about Sir Criston Cole, and this is evidently, especially when, you know, he asks her favor, a bit of a love interest set up for her, especially with some of the extra bonus peaks that you get from him in future scenes. And after he gets the favor as well, there's a little bit of like, oh, you know what's going on there. But this is where we're nearing the end of the episode with the queen now in labor. And it gets messy. Really, really messy, as you know. All while this is happening, we get cuts between the labor and the jousting. Some knights get super, super triggered and start fighting each other after one of them falls off. And it gets insanely bloody. The kind of face ripping off level of bloody. And this is where the Maester proposes to the king that it's sometimes necessary for the father to make an important possible choice to sacrifice one or lose them both. And this is the thing, and they get into this a little bit behind the scenes. Like, he has to make a choice whether to save his potential son, because it could have been a girl, and that would have been an even bigger troll on everything that happens, or if he doesn't make that choice, they will both die. So in all reality, he kind of had to make that choice. It's just the way it went down, and he couldn't tell her that. She was obviously terrified. It was done against her will. It obviously would have been nice to say, look, if I don't save the child, then you're both going to die. So at least she would have had some choice in the matter. It was just truly horrific and sad, this scene, and extremely messed up. Also, in that fight between Daemon and Kristen, we have basically Kristen come out on top, because we have Daemon just getting cocky, gets struck from behind, but obviously Kristen wouldn't dare, despite other people getting butchered in the face, you wouldn't exactly finish off a prince, the heir to the throne, so that's why he asks him to yield, and he refuses to. He doesn't say anything, but obviously you're not gonna then strike down on the frickin' prince, the king's brother. And this is when the queen dies, and the baby is born, but oh man, as soon as I heard that kind of choking noise in the background, yeah, it was ultimately this big tragedy, and this is when we have the funeral. For those who didn't quite hear, the baby struggling to breathe or whatever, it's very evidently shown with the two bodies that were about to be cremated, because it's Targaryen tradition to have their bodies, you know, struck with fire. And that's when we have Rhaenyra instructs her dragon by saying Dracarys. Syrax then lights up the bodies, and in this moment you could see that Daemon was very sad and saying that, you know, your father needs you. So again, adding that he does actually care. He's not like Viserys in Game of Thrones, who was just an absolute dick to Dany. And talk about bad timing, back in the council chambers, we have the hand of the king, Otto just saying, yeah, I know this is bad timing, but the question of your succession is at hand, and this turns into a bit of a squabble, because they're like, well, the succession is already said by precedent and law. And then we have Corlys saying, yeah, shall we say his name? Daemon Targaryen. But they don't want him to be king, specifically Otto, obviously, with the tension those two characters have between each other. He even compares him to Maegor the Cruel, like he's impulsive and violent, and he could be worse. And Maegor the Cruel was an absolute the worst of the worst on the Iron Throne as a Targaryen. And in the meantime, we have frickin' Daemon Targaryen like chilling, you know, eavesdropping on all of this, which spurs him to have that speech. And with the added context, of course, in the throne room with regards to how, you know, he feels like he's been sent away. So all of this contributes to the inner drama that's going on here. That's when we get Lady Alicent visit the king. Meanwhile, we get the pleasure house scene of when we have Daemon make that speech saying heir for a day or king for a day, which reminds me of Green Day's performance at that festival saying king for a day. I could imagine, you know, that would be Daemon's favorite track. And of course, Otto takes this opportunity to just, you know, bring an L to Daemon through having some witnesses at that pleasure house, informing the king of this somewhat mockery with regards to the death of his son. This leads to that confrontation we've already basically discussed. The king announces to his brother that he is no longer heir, and that he is to return to Runestone with no quarrel, but yeah, he tries to approach the king, the king's guard, are like, you coming close, mate? But this is just a powder keg for things to come. Things are going to get messy. And this is where we get the moment by the dragon skull, Balerion the Black Dread's dragon skull, and we have the king inform Rhaenyra that he wants her to be queen. All while this is happening, we have certain lords and council members and whatnot swearing to be faithful to King Viserys and his faithful heir, Princess Rhaenyra, pledging fealty to them. We even get like a little appearance of Rickon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, so that's nice to see, and I'm sure we'll maybe see more of characters like this pop up with nice little hints at the families of what we're very familiar with in the future. This is also where they somewhat foreshadow and set up the Game of Thrones, and that is through Viserys telling Rhaenyra about Aegon's dream. It wasn't just conquest seeing Westeros, it was that he had a dream about a song of ice and fire. He foresaw this terrible winter that would be the end of the world of men, gusting out the distant north, and he says that when this eventually comes, because he's expecting it, he doesn't know when it's going to come, it could be like a year from now, 10 years from now, as we know, it's kind of 170 years from now, but it's still relevant because it's what brings this somewhat responsibility on Viserys and shows that he is kind of a good king trying to do the right thing, and he's trying to bestow it upon this responsibility his daughter will now have, and that is to bring the people of the Seven Kingdoms truly together. This is going to be a very impossible task for Rhaenyra, because not only does she have the task of bringing everyone together, which is a very hard thing to do, but also as a woman of whom the realm just won't really want to accept. I like how he was gripping the dagger as well, the very dagger that was used to kill the Night King, because it was also a secret passed down from king to heir, with that very secret story of A Song in Ice and Fire somewhat inscribed on that very dagger. As the episode comes to a close, we see Daemon Targaryen take off on his dragon to probably plan a few things, and we have Rhaenyra announced as the heir to the Iron Throne. This has now broken the precedent and tradition. There's never been a queen, let alone ever been an heir woman to the Iron Throne. And with this, there will be much trouble ahead. Now, the promo gets into quite a bit of this with teases. I might break this down in a separate video because it's not just a promo for the next episode. It's like a promo for multiple episodes ahead. It looks like there is some crazy stuff, of course, of what you would come to expect with a Thrones show. But that basically ends the episode, and I have to say, I was really impressed. I didn't really see any issues. Now, issues could come. I think we all know quite a lot of the consensus on the final couple of seasons, or even before that, of Game of Thrones. As much as I still subjectively enjoyed them, there were issues that could still come into the future of this show, but I don't want to put a little bit of a prediction on a bad note. So going off of this first episode, not only do I love the cast, I like the way it was shot, the story and how it's being set up and the way it was handled was very decent to me. I don't really have any issues. I just thoroughly enjoyed this, and it does feel like the start of a new thing, like a new moment. We all know how big Game of Thrones was. Of course, it's hard to not make a comparison, but it was such a tradition for even people and friends to watch Game of Thrones with their family. Everyone got together, and it really does feel that with the gravitas of this episode, that people just might connect to this in a similar way. Even though it's a prequel and everyone knows where everything's going to end up, it feels like they did execute this in such a way that could very well have the potential to be just as special to fans as even Game of Thrones was. I know that's quite bold to say, it really is, but if we have more episodes as strong as this first one, then you never know. You never know. I just wanted to put that out there. So I want to pose that question to you. A, what did you just think of this episode? What did you think of the cast, the characters, and everything like that? But do you think that this has the potential to kind of instill that, as what I was just saying, moments amongst friends where you watch it together, everyone's having reactions like into that of the Red Wedding? And, I know I'm getting ahead of myself there, but it does feel like the start of a new era, and I was, kind of skeptical if House of the Dragon could pull it off, despite it being based on some source material, even though they have a lot of wiggle room to do a lot of their own innovation there. But that just, emboldens me even more. They do have a lot of room for expansion here to make some really interesting choices. Obviously, they have to follow really big plot points that is in the history of the Thrones universe, so that is self-explanatory, but there's going to be some shocking moments ahead. So let me know your thoughts on that, and let me know your thoughts on this episode. And also, if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate a like, because obviously I don't have like a massive Thrones audience, so you can let me know by leaving a like, and let me know if you want to see more breakdowns on this show week to week, of course. But other than that, subscribe, check out my links in the description below to follow me on various places. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you people of Westeros in the next video. Goodbye.